Karen was a figure most people in her suburban neighborhood tried to avoid. Her presence was hard to ignore, and her opinions were impossible to escape. With her round frame and signature short, choppy blonde haircut, she resembled a character straight out of a movie, one who'd been cast to play the entitled, grumpy neighbor. She had a knack for making herself the center of attention, especially when it came to matters of neighborhood security. Although she wasn't an official member of the HOA, that didn't stop her from attending every meeting, where she dominated the conversation with complaints about everything from tree trimming to the type of cars parked on the street. Karen's favorite targets, however, were the new residents. Her version of keeping the neighborhood safe always seemed to involve making false accusations, particularly aimed at Black and minority families. She claimed to be concerned, but in reality, she was acting out a deep-seated prejudice, which she disguised under a facade of self-righteousness. Karen believed she was the guardian of tradition and propriety, someone who had a say and who belonged in her suburban utopia. She would call the police for the most trivial reasons: kids playing in the yard, an unfamiliar car parked on the street, or a new neighbor who she believed didn't fit the neighborhood's image. Her favorite pastime, however, was harassing Daniel, the only Black man in the cul-de-sac. Despite his status as a respected businessman and homeowner, Karen couldn't fathom that someone like him could afford to live in such a prestigious neighborhood. She often muttered under her breath, convinced he must have stolen his way into the property. The community tolerated Karen, but she held a firm grip over others. Her loud complaints at HOA meetings were filled with drama, and the fear of retribution kept most neighbors silent. Although they seethed with frustration, they kept their heads down. Anyone who dared challenge her risked becoming her next target. She would find something, anything, to make their lives uncomfortable. It wasn't unusual for her to accuse someone of being a threat or spread rumors that made neighbors question each other's loyalty. Behind her aggressive complaints was an unshakable belief that she was right and untouchable. Karen didn't believe in fairness, she believed in control. She patrolled the neighborhood in her oversized SUV, checking to make sure the trash cans were aligned just right and the grass didn't grow too long. She never let anyone forget that she was the self-appointed queen of the suburban kingdom. Despite the resentment bubbling under the surface, no one dared to confront her directly. They understood that doing so would invite her wrath. While neighbors exchanged weary glances behind her back, they endured her presence, quietly hoping for the day when someone would finally put her in her place. One regular afternoon, with the sun shining and the soft hum of lawnmowers in the background, Daniel stood outside his house, in a freshly pressed suit, checking his mail. He was just another busy professional managing his work from home, stepping outside to grab a few letters. To Karen, however, this moment would be anything but ordinary. From her kitchen window, she spotted him. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Daniel's calm demeanor, his attire, and the fact that he was simply checking his own mailbox. Her suspicion grew. She squinted and pressed her hand to the window pane, muttering under her breath, "What's he up to now?" Karen had never liked him, something about his presence in the neighborhood didn't sit right with her. He didn't belong here, and that thought nagged at her. Karen convinced herself that this wasn't a simple act of a man collecting his mail. No, Daniel was up to something sinister. As she watched him, a plan began to form in her mind. Storming out of her house, Karen marched toward Daniel, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. Her face flushed with frustration as she approached. "What are you doing here?" Karen demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. Daniel glanced up, furrowing his eyebrows in confusion. "I'm just checking my mail, ma'am," he said, his voice calm and respectful. He had dealt with Karen's overreactions before, but he hadn't expected one over something so trivial. "No, you're not," Karen retorted, her voice rising. "You don't belong here. People like you don't live in this neighborhood." Her words were venomous, laced with the assumption that Daniel was trespassing or even trying to steal mail. "You're tampering with mail. I'm calling the police." Daniel's confusion quickly turned to frustration, but he remained composed. His arms crossed in front of him, standing tall and unyielding. "Ma'am, I live here. This is my property. Please leave me alone." But Karen wouldn't listen. With her finger pointed dramatically, she whipped out her phone. "I'm calling 911. You can't just walk around here acting like you own the place." Her voice escalated with every word, filled with outrage and entitlement. Moments later, the police arrived, pulling up in front of Daniel's home. Karen rushed toward them, her fingers still pointed at him. "That man is tampering with the mail. He doesn't belong here," she said, her voice urgent. Daniel remained unfazed, pulling out his ID and offering it to the officers, explaining that he was the homeowner. The officers glanced between Daniel and Karen, clearly skeptical. They checked the records on their phones, confirming that Daniel's name was indeed on the property's deed. "Ma'am, he lives here. There's no need for us to get involved," one of the officers said, his expression neutral, but lacking the urgency Karen had hoped for. Furious, Karen huffed and turned away, muttering insults under her breath. "This isn't over," she spat. "I'll be keeping an eye on him. I don't trust him." As the officers left and Karen stood fuming, Daniel simply shook his head. He knew this wasn't the first time, and likely wouldn't be the last, that Karen had let her prejudices take control. But what she didn't know was that her overreaction would lead to a discovery that would change everything. Daniel had always been a man of patience, but Karen's harassment had pushed him too far. He had never backed down from injustice, and now her attempt to have him removed from his own property was the last straw. That evening, after work, Daniel sat down with his laptop and started looking into public records. Initially, there didn't seem to be much, but after some digging through local government databases and HOA complaints, he stumbled upon something that raised his eyebrows. Karen had been collecting disability checks for years, claiming she was unable to work due to medical reasons. However, she had been working under the table at various retail jobs, none of which she reported to the government. Not only had she been fraudulently collecting disability payments, but she had also been making side income without paying taxes. The system had been used to her advantage, and it was clear she had gotten away with it for far too long. As Daniel continued his search, he uncovered even more disturbing information, a criminal record for identity theft. Karen had once been caught using someone else's personal information to open accounts in their name. Even more shocking, he discovered multiple sealed records suggesting she had been involved in other shady dealings, including attempts to scam neighbors under the guise of community improvement projects. But the real bombshell was the discovery that Karen wasn't even the legal owner of her house. For years, she had been squatting in a property that wasn't hers. The name on the deed belonged to an elderly woman who had been moved into a nursing home and was unaware of Karen's occupation. Daniel's heart raced as he processed the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Karen wasn't just an entitled, racist neighbor, she was a criminal who had been living off the system for years. The discovery was earth-shattering, and Daniel knew exactly how to use it. The woman who had tormented him and his neighbors was about to face the consequences. But Daniel didn't rush. He needed to be strategic. His first step was to report Karen's fraudulent disability claims to the authorities. Armed with the evidence he had gathered, he contacted the state's disability fraud hotline, detailing her under-the-table work and medical claims. The investigators promised to look into the matter. Next, Daniel turned his attention to the HOA. He compiled a report about Karen's criminal record and manipulative behavior and presented it to the HOA board members. They were shocked by the extent of her deception. The final blow came when Daniel contacted the rightful owner of Karen's house, an elderly woman named Mrs. Margaret. Her family, devastated to learn the truth, immediately began legal proceedings to evict Karen from the property. With each step, Daniel could feel Karen's grip on the neighborhood slipping. Eventually, Karen's reign of terror came to an end. She was evicted from the home she had squatted in for years. Her fraudulent disability checks were halted, and she found herself without the steady stream of income she had once relied on. But the worst was yet to come. Karen was arrested for fraud, her past crimes finally catching up to her. As she was handcuffed and loaded into a police car, her desperate screams echoed down the street. "This isn't fair. I didn't do anything wrong," she cried, completely oblivious to the years she had spent ruining others' lives. The community, which had long feared her, now stood united in triumph. With Karen gone, the weight of her manipulation was lifted from their shoulders. Neighbors began to reconnect, sharing stories of how Karen had tormented them. Daniel, once the target of her abuse, found himself respected by those around him. The final shot of the video captured Daniel standing tall in front of his house, casually checking his mail. This time, he was not interrupted by Karen's false accusations. Instead, it symbolized the newfound freedom the neighborhood had gained. The video ended with a satisfying shot of Karen being loaded into the back of a police car, her face twisted in disbelief. The community had finally found peace, and the justice they had long hoped for had been served.